So welcome back to the Hot Flash Diaries podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Caceres, and today we are excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Nan Wise. She is a distinguished sex therapist, neuroscientist, and author. She has spent years studying the connections between hormones, brain chemistry, and women's sexual health. With her expertise, she's helped countless women navigate the challenges of midlife, including perimenopause and menopause. And today she's here to talk about something often overlooked in midlife, and that is pleasure. We'll explore why good sex matters, how it changes as we age, and how women can reclaim their sexual health and enjoy. Let me start that last piece again. We'll explore why good sex matters, how it changes as we age, and how women can reclaim their sexual health and joy in perimenopause and menopause. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Nan Wise.
Thank you for having me, Jess. So I'd like to start by making a very firm statement that pleasure is not a luxury. It's a necessity for a well-functioning emotional brain and for a healthy life physically, emotionally, sexually, and relationally. So I wrote a book called Why Good Sex Matters, Understanding the Neuroscience of Pleasure for a Smarter, Happier, and more purpose-filled life. And the reason why I wrote the book is actually to help people to understand how the brain-mind works so that we can work it better. And I unpack in the book the new science of affective neuroscience, a study of emotions, recent research that shows how our brains are wired with 7 distinct emotional instincts that we share with all mammals. The bottom of our brains are very similar, but the top of our brains are very different. So I'm going to give you the punchline to our talk. Actually, post-menopause, women can have a better sex life than ever, and many of us do. So what we're up against is something that, we need to understand that sex is a biopsychosocial phenomenon. Yes, biology counts, and there are challenges as our bodies navigate the changes of menopause, during which our ovaries fail, and there's a lot of changes and shifts. It can come with a lot of symptoms. Fortunately, no woman has to suffer because there are wonderful hormone treatments as well as things that you can do. The bottom line, though, is after our bodies adjust, and they do, there are a lot of compensatory factors that come into play. And literally, even though for example, your estrogen levels fall, all your hormone levels fall, your brain makes more receptors for estrogen. Not that that's the be-all, end-all, but it's really more about, I think, our beliefs about our sexuality, our concept of ourselves as sexual beings having somewhat of a kind of expiration date in our culture.
Yes, exactly.
And if we get over that, many women do, get over the idea that we exist for the male gaze and we have to look a certain way, that our sexuality has to look a certain way. When we get more comfortable in our skin, and we can, being in our bodies, and when we kind of have a freer attitude, a more relaxed, freer attitude, there's actually some indication now. I don't know if you're aware there's something called the sexual recession going on where younger people are having less sex than ever. That in some ways the older people are doing better than the younger people when it comes to getting funky with each other. The younger people have been hijacked by their devices. Their social brains haven't developed properly. Gen Z, I call them Gen Crazy. They have such high rates, I don't mean it personally to them, but they have such high rates of anxiety disorders and all sorts of issues that make it very hard for them to regulate themselves and connect with each other. So getting back to the possibilities of our erotic potential continuing on past menopause and blooming until the day we die. So what we've done I wrote a book, I told you, and in the book, I talk about some of the lessons that I learned from my research participants. So I went back to do a PhD at 50.
I love that.
They said I was too old, but I wasn't.
Never too old.
So I did a neuroscience PhD, and my dissertation work was looking at what happens in the brain when you have imagined genital stimulation and actual genital stimulation leading up to orgasm. So I did functional MRI studies, which allowed us to non-invasively study the brain of women when they were masturbating their clitorises in the scanner, but they had to keep their heads really still. And also when they had partners reaching in and stimulating their clitorises to orgasm. Kind of a tricky thing. Not a sexy place, the scanner.
No.
But back to the lessons. My research participants ranged in age from 24 to 74. And I interviewed them. So my dissertation and my published studies are about the brain correlates and that. But I also wanted to know about them and their journeys. And what I found out was they all had some challenges. Many of them had experiences of sexual assault or abuse. Many of them had relational issues and things that got in the way. And they all told me the same thing. They were really determined, one way or the other, to learn to love being in their bodies and unfolding their sexuality. So they're being able to donate an orgasm or two to science was actually kind of like what I think a sexual empowerment thing, like because back in the day, women used to burn their bras. I think we're going to have to be doing that again with the way things are going. The younger generation's going to have to go out and protest like we did, when I was younger. But what we found out was they learned to love their bodies. They learned to relax into their erotic potential. And that what we do know from people who are partnered and have sex for, many years, what makes for good sex is not how many orgasms you have, not how hard a penis is or how the body is functioning. It's all about connection.
Yes.
And when you feel connected with yourself, and as you get older, you work out some of this self-doubt. Hopefully you kind of come into your own feel. And one of the nice things about actually, as our hormones change, and you notice that women, as we get to a certain age, we sprout more facial hair and stuff. That's because the relative levels of things like testosterone to the estrogen, and, the testosterone is actually higher in comparison to the other hormones. And we get a little fiery, we get a little feisty, and we can actually end up having a pretty darn good time in the bedroom.
That's amazing, right? That is so hopeful for people to hear that just because you've been told in perimenopause and menopause that, all of a sudden you've hit this expiry date, that actually that's not the case at all. In fact, you can have a fantastic time and possibly even a better time than you did when you were younger, right?
Yeah.
Which is amazing.
And when you kind of free yourself up from your sexuality existing for somebody else, and you're not so concerned about, does my ass look fat? You're like more able to kind of be accepting of yourself and enjoy the fun of being in your body. And you know what, for heterosexual people, what men tell me? That what turns them on about a partner is their being relaxed and comfortable in their body, not so much how their bodies look. Women are much more, I think, paranoid about that, so it's kind of learning to incorporate our erotic energy and actually expand it. What I say to people is get turned on by life. It's never too old. You're never too old to have a happy childhood, which is my next book, How We Can Heal from Childhood Trauma. And you're never too old to have a really amazing sex life. It's the most important sex organ is the brain.
Yes.
And I published a study that showed that women, my participants, when I just asked them to do this imagery condition to imagine pleasurable stimulation from a dildo being inserted, compared to having a speculum put in during a pelvic exam. You always have to compare conditions in fMRI because there's no real baseline. And what my data showed was that when women were imagining, pleasurable erotic stimulation, their brains looked very much like they were having an orgasm.
Interesting.
And I spun off an exercise that I suggest to my clients, males and females, that if you're not feeling in touch with your sexual sensations, if you're finding it hard, for example, to have an erection if you're a man, or arousal if you're a woman, or an orgasm in either case, what you can do is an exercise that trains you to pay attention to sensations. I call it touch, imagine touch. It's on my website. It's in my book. So if you gently touch your genitals, not looking to create an erection or arousal, but just feeling the sensations, and then you think about touching the genitals. What we know in neuroscience is that often when these neurons, these cells fire together, they wire together, and what we're really doing is creating a more robust pathway, the pleasure pathway.
Incredible.
And we're training ourselves to tune into sensations. And again, what gets in the way of sexual functioning for people of all ages and all genders and all orientations is when we're too much in our head. We're not in our sensations and we're not in the moment.
So a mindful exercise, really, right?
Which is touching your, stroking your genitals. And if you touch yourself lightly, if you're paying attention to it, you're going to feel little after effects, subtle sensations. And because the worst thing for us is that we're on our devices all day long, we're hijacking our brain systems, which is really not working out well. That was the point of my book, one of the big points of the book, that what we're really doing is we're getting back into cultivating attention on sensations. And then the sensations, we can feel a wider range of them. So you can train yourself to get back in touch with your body. So if a woman, for example, is going through some challenges, one of the things about symptoms as you're transitioning, it's a transition, you know, and for some people it can last quite a while. The perimenopause, as you know better than me, can be a long period of time, and people can have all sorts of symptoms. And if people can see this in a way that is less catastrophizing or awfulizing and going, this is like a developmental step.
Exactly.
We go through puberty. Now, no one really knows why human beings go through menopause, because our close relatives, primates, don't do that. There's all sorts of theories, but, if you think of it as a transition, and what you can do is you can let those symptoms that you're having become an opportunity to kind of lean into how you can listen into the symptoms and take better care of yourself. And when I say better care, I'm not talking about facials or manicures. I'm talking about really listening in. Where do we need to set boundaries? How do we need to reestablish the dynamics in our lives? How can we stop working so hard and begin to prioritize our own pleasure? Right. And by the way, sexual stimulation and orgasm can be a great pain reliever for women who are having, whether it's menstrual cramps or discomfort that goes along. It can help with headaches. It can help with hot flashes. And I'm not saying you're always going to be in the mood if you're feeling symptomatic, that you're always going to be in the mood for sexual stimulation. But on my live stream today on Instagram, I'm working with an OBGYN, Dr. Maureen Slattery. She's actually a sex educator and a sex counselor, and a woman who's a fabulous psychologist who studied relationships. We were floating this idea that we're starting an orgasm a day practice, that we're going to commit to it, because you know what orgasm does for the brain. Actually, the genital stimulation, it helps. It's not like all of a sudden the orgasm, it's everything that's good happens in the orgasm.
Right.
General stimulation leading up to orgasm stimulates so many different regions of the brain, and then also releases so many feel-good, good-for-you neuropeptides. The pain relieving system in the brain, the endorphins or internal opioids, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin. In my data that I showed in my dissertation, looked at the brainstem and all of these regions that caused the release of all of these substances, and boy, oh boy, they were online. So, I know
It's incredible.
people are struggling a little bit now, especially women, about we're not feeling safe. What's happening with politics? How is it that we are not equal citizens and that we don't have, rights to choose for our body? I mean, that's really fundamental.
Agreed,
So
yeah.
the idea of us, instead of giving into fear and anxiety, go, you know what? I'm going to commit myself to pleasure as a practice because it's a mood lifter, mood enhancer, stress reducer. And so I am starting this project for myself and some of my colleagues, and I'm encouraging your listeners and you and anybody else to join us on Instagram for this. An orgasm a day makes the stress go away.
I love that.
And actually, for your listeners, anybody over the age of 56, the Magic Wand Vibrator Company is doing a study, and they're looking for women of that age group to literally study what is the effect of having an orgasm on a regular basis. How's that going to affect our moods, our sleep, all sorts of, stuff functioning, So
Absolutely.
I
can't
my
see
case.
Anything bad coming from this, right?
No. Now, the only caveat I would say, and I said this too in my conversation today on Instagram, is that we want to avoid the striving for the orgasm, because when we get into the mind of the orgasm as the goal, and this comes from Dr. Beverly Whipple, who was my mentor. She was the lady who first named the G-spot. She was one of the preeminent first sex scientists, her along with Barry Komisarek, and they wrote The Science of Orgasm, and they were my mentors. I did my work in Barry's lab of striving, and making orgasm a goal can often backfire, because it's the striving. And you know what? One of the things I like to say, all things, orgasms are great. And if you can have them, by all means. But if we're chasing the orgasm, often a watched orgasm won't boil.
Right.
So if we're in our heads waiting for the orgasm, we're not in the sensation channel. We're not feeling the sensation. So I would always say, it's great to have an orgasm a day. And if you are striving or being so goal-oriented, it can get in the way.
Well, it takes away from the whole purpose of the exercise, right?
Exactly. And being in your experience.
Exactly. And for those of us that are type A goal-oriented human beings, taking a step back and saying, wait a minute, maybe today isn't a day that we achieve that goal, but maybe tomorrow we could do it twice, right?
Right. Well, it's also the kind of idea, if we think about experiencing. What I love about sex is when your sensations take you away. And the only way sensations can kind of take you away is to be in the sensations. And I'd like to make a point too, because there are women and men who have orgasms and don't experience pleasure or satisfaction in their orgasms. And there are women and men who don't have orgasms who find themselves pretty satisfied anyway. Right. Not to say that, anorgasmia can be a real challenge for women. In fact, one of my dear friends is the founder of the Orgasm Research Institute. And she found that medicinal marijuana, like the dose of marijuana, like medical marijuana dose, is not like being high as a kite. But for some women who have had challenges finding their orgasm, the use of marijuana, if it works for them, in small doses can be very helpful for them to release into the sensation channel, because it can enhance sensation.
Interesting. So almost microdosing.
Yeah, and it can be, I always encourage people to experiment. And I'm actually involved with them and Dr. Jordan Tischler from Harvard in petitioning various states to include medical marijuana as a condition. Include female orgasm disorder as a condition for prescribing marijuana. And next we'll follow up with female, they call the sexual interest and arousal disorder, which is where women aren't having they're not in touch with their desire or their mojo.
Right. Well, that's incredible. It's again so hopeful, and it gives people really an understanding of what to focusing more on that connection and even self-exploration too. We talked a lot about that in a previous episode where I had the pleasure of having Marie Cummings Steele, who is a family therapist, on, and we talked a lot about sensuality and sexuality and really about how it's our responsibility to really experience pleasure. It's not anybody else's responsibility, and being in touch with yourself and physically. And I mean that, again, in that emotional and physical connection of knowing, where your special spots are to be touched and so forth are really up to you, right? To understand that. And so,
Okay.
and then communication being such a big part of it in a relationship, because without that, you're not really getting very far in the bedrooms. Yeah.
The number one sexual problem is that people have a hard time talking about sex with their partners. That's the number one partner. The number two, I think, problem is people misunderstand desire, and they think that they need to have that active sexual desire where you're horny and you know it to have a good sex life. And I've talked with Dr. Kelly Casperson, who's the author of We're Not Broken, You're Not Broken.
I love
We're
her,
Not
yes.
Broken. She's fantastic. And we said, fuck desire. You don't need active sexual desire to have a good sex life. In fact, if you can tune into the receptive, responsive desire and kind of cultivate that, that's all you need,
Right.
And the other piece of it, I think, just to back it up for a minute, Jess, and talk about why pleasure is not a luxury. The brain, the emotional brain, the brain itself, the emotional brain really runs the brain, for better, for worse. If it's imbalanced, it can be for worse. But each of those emotional systems that I talked about, the 7 different systems, are all designed as instincts for our survival and our thrival. And the brain works on 2 signals, pain and pleasure. So ideally, pain helps us avoid that which is harmful. And pleasure is designed to approach things so that we approach things that hopefully feel good and are good for us. So where things have broken down now is that we have a whole bunch of faux or false pleasures. For example, being on social media and getting likes can stimulate your dopamine, but it's not satisfying and actually can flatten the dopamine system when we need the dopamine system to get the enthusiasm, the seeking energy to go out and meet our needs. So the healthy pleasures, I like to talk about healthy hedonism, and I do in my book, things that feel good for you and are good, things that feel good and are good for you. So examples, consensual sexual activity with somebody who you like and who likes you, or sexual activity with yourself. Or foods that taste good and are good for you, moving your body, being in your body. The exploring itself can feel good.
For
So
sure.
when you move around in your body, you're exploring, you feel curious. So to create a good sex life, I was just talking about this I was part of a relationship training. I'm a certified relationship specialist too, and a certified clinical hypnotherapist. I've had a lot of years at 67.
I was going to say, is there anything you don't do?
Well, I don't prescribe medication. I'm not that kind of doctor, but it's like I've had a lot of years, and most of that time, Jess, I was learning what I needed to know. In my book, I write about how I had awful panic attacks in my early 20s, and I thought I was so messed up, and I thought my life was over. And I've spent a lot of my early adulthood trying to work that out. And, traditional psychotherapy did very little for my panic attacks. It was interesting, but not very useful. And it wasn't until I actually went to the Mind Body Institute at Harvard Medical School to learn some it was training in behavioral medicine, where they were suggesting we all do yoga. They were teaching us some mindfulness, like breathing, that I started to notice, whoa, I can actually change up my nervous system. And I went on to become a yoga fanatic, where I became a yoga teacher, not to teach yoga, but to learn the breath tools. So and all of these things, including the energy locks, which I talk about in my book. That's great for women who are having symptoms, whether it's PMS issues or whether it's perimenopause symptoms. There are these practices that you can do just with your breath and using energy locks, which the bottom one is actually the floor of the pelvis.
Mm-hmm. That's
that
right.
can alter your nervous system in a way so that you can become calm, present. And when we're feeling safe, calm, and present, we can tap into so many resources. So I was saying this was my own journey. So, I was looking to figure out, how do I navigate my emotional systems? And I come from a long line of people who suffer from anhedonia. So anhedonia is a fancy word for having trouble experiencing satisfying pleasures. And it's actually something that comes along with high levels of stress and actually becomes a cause for stress and depression and anxiety. It comes along with it and it makes it worse. That for me, learning to prioritize pleasure, especially as a type A person, that it wasn't a luxury, that I really need to help. And this is especially for women in midlife as you're transitioning and you're not feeling all that great and you're not, like it's a challenging time when I went through an abrupt menopause, which figures because, I'm always in a rush, and it was a premature abrupt menopause that was like, start to finish in a year, and I really felt shitty. And back in those days, they did want to give you hormones, but I did not like the hormones that they had. I didn't like how I felt. So I went and I asked my doctor to get me bioidentical hormones, which he wasn't thrilled about. But boy, oh boy, during that transition time, that helped so much.
For sure.
So, now, fortunately, there's so much awareness. So that was a long time ago already, where I went through my premature menopause. But, it's hard when you're not feeling well to think about anything being pleasurable. I felt like I was hormental is the way I called it, irritable. It was like PMS on the steroids. But the happy thing is, after I transitioned, I was on the hormones for a while, but after that, I didn't even need them. So my body found its own balance. I haven't been on hormones probably since at least maybe 5 years after the transition. And I don't have vaginal dryness.
Amazing.
I think my life sometimes is what gets in the way of my feeling, in touch with my sexual energy, because I'm somebody who's a little high strung, but I also have been able to work with my nervous system enough where I came from a place where even thinking about doing public speaking was freaking me out. And when you do a PhD and you're doing a research PhD and you're doing a lot of presentations, I had a lot of opportunity to work with that. By the time, and this was actually from the breath work and using the yogic energy locks. By the time I completed my graduate school and then went on to write my book, I went on the Today Show the day before New York closed down. I wasn't even nervous. I was so happy to be there. And I was actually in the room paying attention to Maria Shriver and Dr. Jennifer Shepard. Jessica Shepard, I'm sorry. Jessica. Who just came out with the book Generation about menopause.
And she's a Canadian. Did you know that?
I didn't know that she's a Canadian. I could tell with your O sounds that you probably grew up there. Yeah. You say a boot?
A boot, yeah.
A boot, yeah. So that's kind of my story. That's how I got to this moment. And it's really been, my life I can't say that I ever had in my mind that I could have bloomed into loving, my career and having the life that I have now, because my map was so infiltrated with anxiety and, all of that, panic attacks and what have you.
It's encouraging because there's so many of us out there who are type A's and go-getters and, 400 things on our plates, and transitioning into perimenopause and menopause. A lot of women who have, professional careers and also still younger children at home and lots going on. It's just non-stop. So what do you tell your patients then that say, look, I'm not having vaginal dryness, I'm not having pain with intimacy, I just don't feel like having sex, but I do want to have sex because I want to have this relationship with my partner. What do I do? What do you tell these ladies?
So the first thing that I say is to start by giving yourself full permission to be just as you are, and for this best for you to be where you are. So radical acceptance is actually the active ingredient in all mindfulness practices. So if you let yourself be as you are and you listen into the information, like what is that lack of sexual desire trying to tell you? I'll tell you one thing I show them is a very basic breath tool. Long, smooth inhale, and then you hold it for a little bit and you make your exhalation a little bit longer than the inhale. Because the number one cock blocker of our sexual desire is stress. So if we can help reset the nervous system, anytime you're in your mind, which we go in our minds, or anytime you're like running around like a chicken without a head, your body's tense. If you can condition yourself to have that be the prompt to just slow down, the long, smooth inhale, and then the longer, smooth exhalation, it kicks in the vagal brake, and the vagal brake is when the parasympathetic calming restorative nervous system begins to kind of take charge. Your body feels safe. And when in that space, what I ask people to do is kind of like listen into your life. You know, a lot of times we are running on adrenaline. We're so addicted to adrenaline and we're overstimulated and everybody's moving at this pace and we're on our devices and we're just, listening to the news. We're all over the place. And if you can bring a little bit more breath into your body and get a little curious about your life, I think one of the biggest changes in midlife that we really need to do is take an inventory.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to say this. We live in a patriarchy. All right. We know that because otherwise there would be people telling us what we could do with our bodies elected to office. That wouldn't happen. And within that patriarchy, there is a privilege to being a man. Not that I'm against men. I love men. I'm married to one forever. But when we look at how hard women work in and out of the house, because it's almost like we don't notice the wallpaper. There's a tremendous imbalance for most women, not every woman, not every relationship, but particularly in heterosexual relationships where the man has more of what we can call a entitlement to pleasure, entitlement to sexuality, where largely a lot of the heavy duty hauling and working is being done more in the house by the woman, even if she's working outside of the house. And not to blame our husbands, our partners, but to just go, okay, let's take a step back. Let's think about how we can get in better balance ourselves with our nervous systems by calming the nervous system enough to be present, to be paying attention to the emotions as information. And how can we work with our lives, including our partners, to get in better balance? And that may include redistribution of how we go about our responsibilities. It may include paring down a little bit on how much we are thinking that we have to do this or have that to be happy. In fact, we get that backwards. Most people think if I just get the PhD or just get the house or just get the kids or the husband, then I'll be happy. And we know that's not how happiness works. We actually habituate to when we have these new accomplishments or whatever, which then that's why new relationships have, you have that new relationship energy only for a while. We habituate. And so what really makes people way more happy is by stepping into how we can be more balanced, how we can choose from a place that's more grounded, how we can choose to step into gratitude, to doing what we need to do from that place of feeling like we have enough, we are enough, we have all of our inner resources, and we can get a little help from our friends, making some different choices. And I think one of the big things that women, when they get to a certain age, in middle age, they find that they're running out of patience. And I say that's a good thing. Because we get wired, not just by our biological brains, which have a lot of circuits for oxytocin, where men have those circuits, but they have more circuits for vasopressin, which is more like testosterone, right? So they actually have more sex on the brain than women. Women tend to be encouraged to be relational. And what does that mean? We're supposed to take care of everybody. And we are not supposed to say no. I remember my mother taught me being selfish is awful. You're selfish. She gave me a lot of messages like that, which really weren't very helpful. I think my mom had a lot of her own struggles and she wasn't a particularly happy person. But that being said, if we take the step back and we learn about like taking the pause instead of saying yes, you know what? I'll have to think about that. I'll let you know. And when we lower all of that caretaking, then the brain systems that can get overloaded by caretaking and have too much actual of the opioids and oxytocin, what we can do is balance that better so that's not cock blocking our access to our lust. And if you bring your stress levels down, then the dopamine's going to be more online for us exploring, for us getting turned on by lives. So we need to take stock at a certain, that's a great time. I think it's an opportune time for us to take a step back and go, okay, what's going to help me? How do I get to be for the next leg of my journey? That's in my chapter 7. How we get to choose how we're going to be for the next leg of our journey so that we'll be more in tune with ourselves, more self-loving, more encouraging and of our own pleasurable pursuits in a way that's going to be more balancing.
Well, and again, there's a couple things I wanted to mention. One is that as women, we are far more complex than men, generally speaking. And men generally can become turned on quite easily, right? It's very primal for them. It doesn't take a whole lot and they can get quite excited. Now that's generalizing. Not all men are like this, but a lot of men are. True. Whereas women, we are, like you said, much in our heads. And, when there's stressors around us and you feel like, oh my goodness, there's 14,000 things to do, you could very well get to the point where perhaps intimacy is underway. But the second you get back in your head and you're thinking about your grocery list or that you forgot to drop your dry cleaning off or, oh my goodness, you forgot to call back, whoever it is, then things just shut down, right? So trying to be really mindful and staying in that place of enjoyment. And again, like you said, pleasure is not a luxury. It's a need.
It's a necessity for a well-functioning emotional brain. And in terms of the differences between men and women in general, in addition to men having more places in the brain for the sex organ, men get enculturated to feel entitled to their sexuality and not to be ambivalent about their sexuality. So women get these to this day, and sometimes even more than before when you think about it. We're supposed to be sexual, but however, not too sexual. We still get the message that our sexuality is for other people's pleasure because we're objects.
Exactly.
And we're not encouraged to masturbate in the same way that, we expect boys are going to spank the monkey, or whatever it is you want to call it. They're going to do that. Boys will be boys and girls, if girls experiment. I've heard this for decades from my college students that there is still that double standard. A boy who sexually explores in college is a hunk. A girl who does it is a slut. Right. So, it's these double standards, and I love to say that America is a lewd, prude nation. We are so ambivalent about sexuality, pleasure. And now, if you think politically, the message that we're given is that it's okay to grab a woman by a pussy, to talk like that.
It's disgusting.
It is disgusting.
And being in Canada, right, we are really no different. It's the same messaging. It's the same conversations. We don't talk about sex. Talking about sex is just awkward. Heck, we don't even talk about our bodies and understanding what's happening in midlife and, even pre-midlife. We don't talk about any of that. And that is definitely one of the driving reasons as to why I decided to start this podcast, because I was talking to so many women and I couldn't stand the idea of A, misinformation, but B, also the fact that we weren't talking about things. I'm just going to turn a light on because it's getting really dark. Sorry.
Sure. So early.
Sorry, but the whole notion of not talking about, intimacy, and also women being an object and not being able to explore their own bodies, and that we're really there to, pleasure our male counterparts or otherwise. And that's why I'm really careful with my patients when they bring up the topic of desire, right? Because I'll ask them if that's something that they want to change, or are they happy with where they're at? Because I think the worst thing we can do is pathologize, that you need to have this, this benchmark for how many times a week you're going to have intimacy or want to have intimacy, when it's all a bunch of baloney, because it's really individualized. And the second that you put a diagnosis on something, well, that doesn't feel very sexy, does it? And certainly that's not going to get the mojo flowing. So I'm really careful about that. And I really try to normalize a lot of what people are feeling, because it is normal, right? It's just that if you want things to change, guess what? There's tons of things that you can do. And It starts with yourself, right?
Yeah, you can cultivate that energy by going into the world and exploring. Learning is a wonderful way to get turned on by life. Going out, learning, exploring. And, what I also think that is particularly for middle-aged women, the biggest issue is actually ageism. It's not something so much internal. It's something we've internalized. So I love to tell this little anecdote about when I did my dissertation. I started in grad school at 50. All right. And at the time I was in great shape. I was running 10 miles at a clip. So I was a young 50. However, when we made this video of my brain having an orgasm, we did this for the Society of Neuroscience, and it crashed the internet, because it was just really a cool thing of the brain. And somebody commented, "Oh, this would be hot if the woman wasn't 50. But this is how people think. Not all people, but, one of my friends wrote a book called This Chair Rocks, Ashton Applewhite, all about ageism. And what we learn, we get trained that old equals ugly for women. Not the same for men, right? So we internalize this. And then, you hear women talking about they feel invisible because people aren't looking at them. And I'm always thinking to myself, a lot of the kind of attention that we get in that way is somewhat unwanted. When you're a young person and people aren't appropriate, how they look at you, whatever. And I'm thinking what's really more important is how we are seeing ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And
true.
People pick up on how we see ourselves. Now, I'm not saying that's going to change how random people on the street are going to see us. But I'm talking about in the provinces of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
If we're feeling good about ourselves, if we're enjoying being in our bodies, if we're looking at the latter part of our middle age as a developmental opportunity for taking some good stands in our relationships, being clear on what we need and what we want, and also being able to find new ways to express our erotic energy, whatever that's going to look like for you, whether it's penetrating, like having different conversations with your partner, whether it's about learning about new things that really turn you on in the biggest of pictures. So we get less hung up on, you got to do sex this way where it's, penis and a vagina with orgasms in the right places. Those sexual scripts are really what fuck us up in the first place.
For sure.
So if we can cultivate a feeling of curiosity, that's the seeking system, one of the wired ones. Then if we think of feeling care, not too much caretaking, but care for ourselves, and we get a little playful, care for our partners, then what can happen is we kind of revisit our lives and our erotic lives as a kind of grown-up playground. So when people don't want to have sex, I'm like, well, can you go and play? Can you think about how you can play. And I actually developed a plan that's modeled a bit on Masters and Johnson, who were the original sex therapists. The sensate focus exercises,
Yes.
where they got people back in touch. But I made up a more elaborate plan. I call it the Get in Touch plan, that includes giving people, even if they've been in long-term relationships, like a new game plan about how to get back in touch with touch. Like when you touch your partner, not to give them pleasure. You don't have to touch to give pleasure, to feel your own sensations. And the most important thing, I think, before and after any of the stages that I outline, like touch first with your clothes on, and then you move on to touch with maybe less clothes on, and then you move on to touching that is you're focusing on giving pleasure, and then towards the end, you're touching each other simultaneously rather than taking turns. And then you conclude the genitals and by agreement, whatever else. But what I think is most important is giving people the suggestion that before they even do that they sit down and they have this opportunity to talk to their partner. What's on your mind? What's going on in your body? What's your emotional weather? What are you feeling about climbing into this practice? What do you want? What do you don't want? And then do a little bit of eye gazing before you actually do it. Like connect up your nervous systems and your emotional brains, breath and eye gazing, and then debriefing after you do this little practice. And it borrows a lot from what we know about people who are kinky.
Yes.
My colleague, Peggy Kleinplatz, wrote a great paper on lessons from extraordinary lovers that teach us vanilla people what we can learn about some good things about sexuality from people who practice kink. Expand your horizons, Get back in touch with touch.
It's interesting because at the very beginning of this sort of segment, you're really talking about confidence, right? So feeling confident in your own body. And that is super sexy. There is, if you think back to dating days, and I was single for 10 years, so I dated a lot after I left my daughter's dad. So I remember dating a variety of different men, and I was always most attracted to those that were confident. And knowing myself as I transitioned and became a very different person over the last, many years, you're always evolving, that stepping into my confidence, especially as now a 42-year-old gal, it feels so darn good. And really that does translate into everything that I do, right? And that includes my playful time with my partner, right? And again, that notion of playfulness is so important. As you were describing some of those things, like eye gazing and, your breath sort of aligning. And it's really, again, about connection. But what that reminds me of is early on in a relationship, because you're doing that at the very beginning of a relationship.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's very possible to have those feelings. And again, there are emotional stages, which you talk about a lot in your work, in terms of relationships. Nobody stays in that honeymoon stage for a long period of time, and that is normal. Everybody needs to really understand that. But it's interesting because they are really little things, but if you're mindful about them and, actually put them into practice, it's amazing.
It's a priority. Pardon my dog from barking. She wants to get out of the room. But you know what confidence really is, I think, operationally, is giving yourself permission to be as you are. So one of the things that we can really learn is, rather than looking for permission from other people, whether it's parents, partners, culture, if we really do this practice of self-attunement, self-acceptance, and like giving ourselves permission to be as we are, if you're authentically you get to be confident. This is who I am. I'm okay with this. I can get close to you. If you're not okay with this, it's not me. Maybe we're not a good fit.
It's the beauty of, again, midlife. You're stepping into I don't give a F energy. This is who I am, and like it or leave it. I don't care. Right. But that's the exciting part. And so
it's so much fun.
It is. And that thought of aging is actually exciting, as opposed to it being, again, that ageist model of, oh my gosh, your boobs are saggy. So who cares? Like, that's who I am. It's amazing. This is part of who you get as a package. Right?
Exactly.
This individual who's, educated, understands herself, knows her body. This is who you're getting. you know?
Yeah,
And
nobody's
it's
worrying
exciting.
about your saggy boobs,
No, nobody
honestly.
cares.
Nobody really cares about, and you know what the thing is, if you really, when push comes to shove, if you take the step back, often young people, my dad used to say youth is wasted on the young, and I think that's a great thing. Because, you get these people who are in these, bodies that they still don't think are good enough.
I know it's
And hold on, I'm going to let the dog out
no
because she's
problem.
driving me crazy. Go ahead, go out. Here, there you go. The dog's afraid she's missing out on some food. But anyway, so like if you can really recognize that you get to a point in your life where you really recognize that all the accomplishments that you're going to do or all the things that you're going to get really aren't going to make you happy. What makes you happy, if you have enough food to eat and, enough so you're not worried about money every day, is the quality of your connections.
Exactly.
And those can grow and deepen and widen over a lifetime. If you just stay present. My husband has a way, he has this funny saying, you can never fuck the same woman twice. And what he means is that if you're with a partner who's growing, she's always becoming, like that was his way of saying that, like we've had a couple of different marriages, like from being really young people. That biological highlighter, new relationship energy really is biological highlighter to get your attention on somebody long enough to figure out, hey, is this a potentially good enough partner, and then to do the work of bonding.
Exactly.
And the work of bonding continues on for our lives to grow together, to grow as individuals, to grow together. And, it kind of, don't think that you have one relationship. It's relating. If you keep relating to your partner, take some risks. That's one of the things that kinky people teach us. There's a big risk in not taking a risk. Penetrate somebody's psyche. Go to the scary places together.
And sometimes that means just talking about sex, right, with our partner, because there's so many people that are challenged or have a challenge in that department, right? They don't know how to talk to their partner about intimacy, or they're afraid to because of the reaction.
Yeah,
but I encourage
about that. Yeah, and in my psychology too. The other thing, here's a fun game you can play, and I learned this from one of my mentors, Dr. Bill Staten, who fabulous. Actually, he's a what do you call that? He's not a missionary. He's actually a minister.
Okay.
But the most sex positive human being on the planet. And he said, go get a copy of Joy of Sex, which is a classic book. Open up the index and sit with your partner and pick out like randomly. Oh, let's look at this page. Would ya? What do you think about that? Have we ever tried that? What do you think about what feelings come up for you? You can explore and kind of look at some of your own boundaries and limits in a way where you can kind of continue to grow and to learn about sexuality for every moment of your life.
Such good advice, for sure. And again, it's hopeful advice, right? Because getting away from that ageist view, we don't want to age, we do want to age. It's actually a privilege and it's exciting, and our relationships evolve like we do, and it only gets better. You've heard it, ladies and gentlemen, right?
It gets better. Things can wax and wane.
Yes.
And then bloom. Wax and wane and then bloom.
And then post-menopausally, even better, right?
God, yeah. Oh, God, yeah. I would not go back. No. I'm like, it was great. And it was a lot of work being a younger me. And I'm like going, this is pretty good. So my plan over the next whatever time I have left is to really try and challenge my boundaries and limits for more pleasure and be able to give myself more and more permission to be however I am. So that's like a huge learning.
That's amazing. I love that so much. Well, I thank you so much that you have taken the time to be on the podcast today. There's just two questions. One might be a little longer than the other, knowing that we could chat probably all night long. But one question that I ask all of my guests is what is one question that you wish people would ask you in your practice, but they often don't?
That's a great question. How can I practice more patience with myself? people are so judgmental of themselves, and so much, shows up in this space. And even they say, oh, I want to be self-loving, but how can you have more patience for yourself and more acceptance for yourself? I think that would do a lot of good if people could contemplate. And I think the bigger question from a lot of people is, what do you want? We know what we don't want.
Mm-hmm.
What do you want? What do you really, really want? Like the Spice Girls.
Yes, that's actually a great, very mindful question, right?
Yeah,
to ask
what do you
somebody.
want?
Because a lot of people don't. They don't know. They've not even thought about it, right?
Nope. They take the maps that were given them about their, from what they've been enculturated from their families, from culture.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't even think about, like, when you partner, what do you want your partnership? Not
exactly.
Like, who do you want for a partner? What do you want in your partnership?
Yeah, what do you want to see come of it, right?
Yeah.
And what are the goals and what are you hoping for sure? And last question is, what is one thing that you like to do for yourself to more about self-care so that you can feel bonita or beautiful inside and out? Something that you do for yourself on a regular basis.
Well, this year, 2025, I'm committing to prioritizing my physical play. I used to be a long distance runner. I used to go to crazy yoga classes so many times a week. So I really had I love physical activity. And I actually have a gym in the basement here in my house. And what I really want to dedicate myself, what makes me feel most beautiful is when I feel healthy in my body, when I feel good in my body, building a little muscle, getting a little bit more flexible. Just because I actually enjoy that. I love moving my body, but for, mostly what I'm doing all day long is sitting down talking to people. So for 2025, what my goal is, actually my commitment is to moving myself more times during the day downstairs in between to do, get on a yoga class on, YouTube, or, get on my total gym or do my bicycle and just have fun in my body.
I love, in addition to an orgasm a day.
An orgasm a day. Yes, we did talk about that.
Well, thank you so much. I will include all of Dr. Wise's information on the show notes, including a link to her book titled Why Good Sex Matters, as well as her website and her social media handles so that you can follow along and get more information from her.
And people on my website, when they can, if they buy my book, like if they do that through Amazon, and they can get a free therapeutic coaching session with me by signing up on the website. So
incredible.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And if
all
people
that
have
information,
questions, they can get a free 15-minute chat with me right on my website. So
awesome.
Feel free. I love talking to people. That gives me great joy, and helping people and listening to people and, holding that space is what kind of gets me up in the morning.
Amazing. Well, I look forward to seeing you in person at Kristen Parisi's conference in the spring in Hamilton. So I can't wait to see you.
And you will meet my colleague, Maureen Slattery, because she's going to be speaking, and we're going to have so much fun.
It's going to be great. I've purchased my ticket.
I look forward to that. So thanks for having me, Jess, and keep in touch. Let me know how everything's going.
We will so much. Take care.
All right. Talk to you soon. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. You as well.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.